So, what I wanted to do is I just wanted to go through the session, sort of reflect upon the session that I taught on illustration and Photoshop and the presentation that I delivered, and go through the checklist that I've created, which is basically neurodivergent teaching checklist that I've made from the research that I've done. One thing that I realised when teaching the session, which was actually quite difficult to do, was familiarise with myself with the students' strengths and weaknesses. This was information that wasn't necessarily given to me, but I think somehow it could go into the plan. I could always do a quick survey with the students before the session to ask what the best ways in which they learn. I did, however, do things like diversify my teaching strategies. So what I did in the session was I did this presentation on moving type. And in the session, we went through the presentation quite briefly, created a sort of calendar, and then created several videos for the students to go through the learning independently. This allowed me the time in order to tend to any students in the classroom, especially if there was any neurodivergent students who needed some help or some support. You'll see through this presentation, especially at the beginning here, I presented what we did before the workshop, so students can kind of get a bit of a time plan or a bit of an understanding as to where we are in the project. And we just sort of briefly started off by having a conversation around that. I made sure that the students knew that there was no silly questions, there was no such thing. There was no such thing as a stupid question. And if students needed to ask questions multiple times, they could. Or if they wanted to talk to me one-to-one, that time that I had to walk around the classroom was there, so I could tend to the students. The next thing we did was we went through this plan, and I always deliver information in small chunks. I think the mistake I've made here on this presentation is I've done this on a white background. I could have done a colour instead. Or definitely not a pattern. That's something that needs to just be eradicated altogether when doing presentations. And using the colour red and green apparently is not good. Apparently it can overstimulate students who are neurodiverse. But I have done things like highlighted the major information. I shouldn't underline things. Apparently I think instead I need to just put that in bold. But I've done the informations in small chunk on the presentations, and I designed it so it animated, so each bit of information was shown bit by bit, so we could talk through it as a process instead of loads of text being on the screen and the students feeling overwhelmed or overstimulated. So I started off by giving them very clear instructions as to what we aim to achieve in the session, so they had a very clear understanding. Then we went through the basics of asking what is a GIF, which is what they needed to create. So together we talked about that. And then I gave them some information on that, and I gave them visual understanding as to what we will be creating. So here it shows that we're creating 6 stills, which would then create a GIF that's moving. So that was, I think, a great way to sort of give a visual understanding as to what we're learning, because sometimes explaining what a GIF just through words can be really difficult for students who are neurodiverse. The thing I wanted to point out before I go any further is that the challenges that I was really faced with was in the session I was sharing the room with another class, which meant that I didn't have much control on creating a sensory conscious environment. I wasn't able to change the lights, but we were able to do things like take a moment from the screen in order to have less screen time, so there wasn't any sort of overstimulation from that. But when it came to noise, that was something that was out of my control, but should always be considered when teaching a session. The other thing I didn't complete or achieve was considering spacing between the characters, between the text. There should be more space between the text in order for students to digest the information easier. And in some areas, I think especially on the last page here where it says before the workshop, I wrote the before part all in capitals. That's something to avoid as well. The other thing I didn't do is here on this page, I didn't choose to make the links in another colour. That would have been something that would have been useful, so the students knew that that's where the link is, because sometimes the link text is quite overwhelming or quite fiddly, and I should have done this on the following pages, if I can get to it quickly. So here I created these pages for the students to have all the links for each of the steps for the workshop, and I could have made those blue or any other colour. Generally, I think with the layout, I think the layouts is good. Headings and structures is good because I've made, on these pages specifically, I've made them highlighted, so we're aware that this is the first part of information and that's the second part. What I could have done was, instead of on these pages everything all being there all at once, I could have started with the header, then shared the links and shared the image on those pages. The other thing that would have been sensible would have been printing out the plan for the day. This is something that students who are neurodiverse particularly need, especially if they can have it before the session. It allows them the time to prepare themselves. The reason I didn't do this, and this wasn't really a conscious decision, is because often I like to allow some sort of room for change in the session, which is something that I do considering neurodiverse students, is I like to sort of get an understanding of the tempo in the class. But for future sessions, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just give a sort of clear layout of the time, but always just allow some time at the end for anything to be completed or adjustments to be made. I was very clear with the students, which is very neurodiverse conscious, is that they didn't necessarily have to complete the task by the end of the day, but they needed to just get an understanding of the task. And at the end of the session, I gave them an extension task, so for them to essentially finish the GIF and to upload that to a Spark site. And for those students who perhaps are not neurodivergent or are just neurodiverse and quite quick at learning, quick at working, to have another go at creating another GIF, but learning from the one that they had designed previously. I think that's everything. One thing I would like to also do is I'd like to also, in future sessions, I would like to produce or create a glossary of words, because especially in this session there was a few words that they perhaps were not familiar with, like GIF, and that's something that I'd want to print out. So along with the plan of the day and the objective printed out, I'd give them a glossary of words. So if they want to familiarise themselves with that before the session, they can, and they can also take that away with them. I think that's the main things that I think I need to work on with my lessons, and perhaps should have made adjustments with this one. But that's what I've taken away from doing the research around neurodiversity.